Charity walks have a long history in the UK, dating from the early 20th century, when the first Polytechnic Marathon was held, although fundraising was not an essential part of the event. It did generate interest in the sport and significant numbers of spectators. By the 1980s, other types of participation, including cycling, walking, and swimming, were developed, and raising money for charities became the primary focus of these events, which were aimed at mass participation. As more events have been scheduled, charities have had to be creative, designing, quote, new experiences that excite, inspire, and dare their supporters into taking part and raising more, end quote, as they compete among themselves for fundraising monies. The Camino de Santiago, since the mid-1980s, has served as one of these innovative experiences to fundraise, but without the mass participation characteristic of a typical charity walk. Laurie Dennett's A Hug for the Apostle on foot from Chartres to Santiago de Compostela, 1988. Paul Graham, Carlos Paternina, and Adrian Wright's Santiago de Compostela, A Journey to Help the Hospices, 1989. And Ben Nimmo's Pilgrim Snail, Busking to Santiago, 2001, all describe journeys on the Camino aimed at raising money. In the introduction to A Hug for the Apostle, Dennett alludes to the need for innovation to raise money and acknowledges that, quote, the public was becoming jaded, end quote, with charity walks. She settles on walking the Camino, believing that the Camino would, quote, interest people not for its novelty, but for its antiquity, end quote. While typical charity walks rely on mass participation and extensive publicity to raise funds, each of the three walks described here capture the public's attention both at home and on the Camino by choosing a unique slant on their journey. Furthermore, the demands of a long-distance walk, such as the Camino, can boost fundraising appeals. Psychologist Christopher Olivola describes what has been called the, quote, martyrdom effect, which finds that people will donate more when an event requires pain or great effort. Thus, the Camino, in its early years of revitalization, became an ideal fundraising choice with its distinctive appeal to donors. Dennett's motivation for raising funds was personal, her own mother's battle with multiple sclerosis, or MS. As a Canadian working in Britain, she made connections on both sides of the Atlantic to develop interest in her project. The MS societies in both the UK and Spain aided in publicity and direct appeals. A Canadian radio station furthered interest by agreeing to receive twice-weekly radio call-ins from the Camino, and fortuitous connections led to assistance from the Spanish National Tourist Office and the High Commissioner for Canada in the United Kingdom. Even before departure, Dennett's publicity efforts had already achieved positive results with corporate donations, sponsorships, and a press reception. The history of the Camino also drew Dennett's attention in her preparation for departure. She chose to start in Chartres, drawn by its historic connections to the pilgrimage and its iconography of St. James in the cathedral. She narrates her journey in a day-by-day format and acknowledges that much was drawn from the diary she kept while walking. While there are occasional comments about her 30-pound pack and the, quote, miraculous polyester cotton blend trousers and the 30-kilometer days of highway walking in France, her narration is in keeping with what she perceives will generate interest. Descriptions of the countryside, the weather, and the historic highlights of each town. Annie Hesp, in her groundbreaking study of first-person Camino narratives, emphasizes that the inclusion of historic details facilitates telling the story of the Camino by bringing alive the location and creating authorial authenticity. The organization and connections completed by Dennett before departure mostly ensures an uneventful trip. She has identified inexpensive hotels along the route, sends packages to be picked up at post offices, and knows the Camino contacts to visit. Her phone calls to the Canadian radio station are the trickiest part of the journey, often made from a cafe or a phone booth on the street. Her resourcefulness while resolving issues and making these calls adds a humorous touch to the narration. Along the way in France, she meets several leaders of the French Camino societies, and in Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, she visits the legendary Madame de Brille, who provides valuable travel information. These notable Camino figures add additional authenticity by their knowledge of the early Camino and their efforts to revitalize the route in modern times. The Spanish portion of Dennett's pilgrimage contrasts sharply with her experiences in France, where she is frequently alone and meets no other pilgrims. When she arrives at the Spanish border, she is met by journalists arranged by the fledgling Spanish MS Society, which uses her pilgrimage to raise public awareness about the disease. After several interviews in Roncesvalles, Dennett remarks, quote, "The amount of attention I've received in the past 2 days, after weeks of passing unremarked in France, is quite intoxicating," end quote. She is frequently recognized by villagers from this point on and experiences many gifts of kindness, which Dennett attributes to the, quote, "living memory of the pilgrimage." In Spain, Dennett begins to experience a more typical pilgrim lifestyle. She now finds basic refugios where she occasionally sleeps on the floor. Other changes include the appearance of pilgrim trails and, quote, "flashes of bright yellow paint." And as Hesp has noted as characteristic of many first-person narratives, Dennett includes the Rio Salado incident from the Codex Calixtinus. Although unlike other modern pilgrims, she states that, quote, "I would never drink from a river with habitation along its banks," end quote. She often feels connected to medieval pilgrims, commenting on the, quote, "muffled tread of pilgrim feet," end quote, the, quote, "thousands of pilgrims before me," end quote, and feeling the hand-shaped space worn smooth over the centuries on the tree of Jesse in the cathedral. Paul Giannone writes about the time shift that pilgrims experience that, quote, "transports them imaginatively to an earlier epoch. At the same time, they experience, quote, a heightened awareness of the present," end quote. Dennett comments, quote, that walking doesn't so much allow me to live in the moment as force me to. The Camino offers an opportunity to reconsider the function of time, and this pause permits introspection. Giannone points out that, quote, "the pilgrim encounters time in a way that is more fulfilling than is normal in modern Western industrialized society," end quote, in this play between past and present time. As in France, she meets the people who early on were associated with the modern Camino, including Jose Maria Alonso in San Juan de Ortega and Elias Valiño San Pedro in Ocebreiro. In Castro Xeriz, Dennett meets her first fellow pilgrims, and as she walks on, she encounters others, and they form a small group that travels together on and off. Dennett, unsure at first of company, realizes that, quote, "walking with other people has turned out to be surprisingly enjoyable," end quote. After the solitude of France, she warms to being with others, sharing meals and conversation. Dennett's arrival in Santiago is a blur of activity, from walking with supporters to the cathedral, to journalists documenting the walk, meeting dignitaries at the cathedral and town hall, making the final radio phone call to Toronto, and sharing a celebratory lunch with her supporters. Only afterwards does she join her fellow pilgrims to spend time with those who had shared her walk. When all have left, she plans to return to Monte de Gozo, to leisurely return to the cathedral, and to calmly complete the pilgrim traditions again. She reflects that, quote, "if the journey meant anything, it meant that the last steps into Santiago were the first steps of another journey." And when I walked into Santiago this past August, I looked to the left at one point, and there on the wall of the Puerto del Camino Hotel was a 9-story mural of Lori Dennett. She has been honored as one of the 7 Estrellas del Camino, and she's the only non-Galician who has been honored with this. 2 years after Dennett walked the Camino, another charity fundraiser would use the Camino to generate interest. Paul Graham, Carlos Paternina, and Adrian Wright, as described in Santiago de Compostela, A Journey to Help the Hospices, set out to raise funds for the hospice movement in Britain. With their theme of life is a journey, they decide that traveling by penny farthing will help attract attention to their cause. And since no hospice movement exists in Spain, they decide to include MS as part of their campaign, as their ride, quote, could draw attention through press conferences, radio, and television interviews to an illness that is little known in Spain, end quote. Much like Dennett, they arranged for publicity to highlight their ride. The narration of this pilgrimage alternates between three participants. Graham starts in Bordeaux on his penny farthing with a departure celebration organized by the French Pilgrim Association. Later, near Burgos, Paternina on his penny farthing joins Graham, and they continue to Santiago. And Wright, who runs the Camino, joins them in Fromista. Each recounts his own perspective on the journey. And here they are drumming up publicity before departure from the UK. Graham includes a brief day-by-day account of towns, meals, and hotels enlivened with historical commentary. Early on, he encounters other pilgrims, both walking and cycling, and meets some of the Camino personalities, such as Madame de Bril in San Jean-Pied-de-Port and Jose Maria Alonso in San Juan de Ortega. He includes the typical Camino stories of the bridge in Puente la Reina and the chickens in Santo Domingo de la Calzada. Most interesting are his experiences riding the penny farthing, its unexpectedness attracting enormous attention. Once again, the Spanish MS Society has arranged for publicity, even providing a van covered with posters to carry supplies. In addition to radio, television, and newspaper interviews, publicity included announcements from the van, as in Logroño. Graham writes, quote, I went round and round the Plaza del Espolón, waving to passersby and patrons of the open-air cafes, while Jesus, in his van, declared through the rooftop speakers, quote, Paul is traveling on his penny farthing to Santiago de Compostela for multiple sclerosis. For the Spanish Society, raising awareness rather than funds was one of the primary goals of the Spanish portion of the trip. As a Spaniard, Paternina writes more about preparation and fundraising before departure, and once in Spain about the difficulties that he encounters with his penny farthing. He has a minor accident in Puente de Órbigo. The back wheel of his penny farthing breaks and is repaired outside of Astorga, and the front wheel suffers unrepairable metal fatigue near Villafranca del Bierzo. He continues with Graham using a standard bicycle, but insists on reassembling and walking his penny farthing the last few kilometers into Santiago. What draws his attention is his easy interactions with other pilgrims, so much so that, quote, complete strangers came to feel that they had known each other all their lives. Wright's section, entitled, quote, Running Through History, covers his run from Fromista to Santiago in 10 days, paralleling the distances covered by the penny farthings. His perspective focuses on the conditions for those on foot. He complains about frequently having to travel on highways with dangerous traffic and getting lost on poorly marked trails. On his way to Rabanal, he encounters a mastiff in the road and claims to be terrified by this creature the size of a small pony, but nothing happens. Walking from Sarria, he follows the yellow arrows and remarks on the beauty of the landscape. Arriving in Santiago on July 25th, the three are received in a similar fashion to Dennett, escorts into the city, reception at the cathedral, and a press conference. Afterwards, each reacts to the arrival. Paternina reflects on motivation for walking. Quote, the real reason for each person can only be found silently on the road to Santiago. For Wright, the journey ends in a visit to the cathedral. Graham meets friends for a meal, quote, to exchange tales of the road, while a spirit of unity enveloped our little company. 3 different pilgrims, 3 different reactions. Each views the end of the Camino from a personal perspective. Compared to the previous 2 appeals, Ben Nimmo's is unconventional. Although the title of his narrative, Pilgrim Snail Busking to Santiago, indicates his destination, and his departure from Canterbury identifies him as a pilgrim, he doesn't follow a traditional path until he reaches Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port. It is a journey sparked by personal trauma, the murder in Belize of Anna, a young woman he loved. The opening of a fund in her name provides the impetus for Nimmo's journey. He will busk with his trombone to Santiago to raise money for the fund. Before departure, he decides to include MS as well, after a friend's mother is diagnosed with the disease. His first busking attempt in Canterbury provides the model he will use. Collecting boxes, one for each charity, emblazoned rucksack on the bench, the magic words coming true at last. Canterbury to Santiago de Compostela for charity. The music he plays, ranging from classical to folk to popular tunes, captivates his audience throughout his journey. The prologue, which begins with Nimmo eyeing the chickens in Santo Domingo de la Calzada's cathedral, quickly engages the reader in a wild, crazy, unexpected celebration of Spanish teenagers, Nimmo and his trombone. A medievalist by training, Nimmo doesn't authenticate his narrative with extensive embedded texts, although there are brief historical mentions throughout, but focuses instead on his thoughts and the personal connections he makes during his 9-month journey. Until he reaches the Camino in Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, he meets no other pilgrims and walks with others on only a few occasions. The solitude he encounters permits what Giannone calls, quote, prolonged meditations on crises, end quote, which leads to the healing he experiences on his journey. At times, he feels the presence of Anna and talks to her. She appears in his dreams, and eventually, as he nears Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, he realizes that she is gone. The trauma of Anna's loss lessens through the healing power of long-distance walking. The narrative structure of his book, while linear by necessity as he recounts his journey, breaks with the day-to-day description characteristic of other first-person narratives. His experiences are recounted in a playful and lighthearted tone. When in Canterbury, he comments, quote, every budding literary giant needs his dream, and mine is to be the next Chaucer. As he wanders through Europe on GR trails, he summarizes many days of walking in rapid bursts. Quote, one by one, the villages went by like a Spike Milligan poem. And quote, villages and chateaux passed like a winemaker's dream. Then he dedicates multiple pages to storytelling about a significant event, encountering a harpist in a medieval chapel, joining a municipal band in France for several days to help with the local celebration, and spending several days with 5 boys and their family who provide him with his pilgrim snail nickname because he carries everything in his pack. He includes several actual diary entries in his narrative to authenticate his experiences. He enjoys the hospitality of a French family that shares their proud tradition of home distilling and samples all the different varieties produced. Quote, one diary entry sums up the story of my first 2 weeks in France, end quote. It is readable, but just barely, as he worries about how his head will feel the next day after consuming all the different spirits. Once Nimmo reaches the Camino, however, the narrative style changes. Although still linear, he focuses on interaction with his fellow pilgrims, their philosophical discussions, and their motivations. Yet he struggles with the quick friendships that end when others walk ahead, as if he dreads the solitude he experienced in France. He finds community, though, in the hostel books, as Nancy Fry describes, quote, the testimonial books become an important form of communication as pilgrims track friends and leave messages, end quotes. And these messages keep him connected to his friends. In Santo Domingo de la Calzada, he meets Helena, a German pilgrim. Quote, with one sentence, she had convinced me she was worth knowing, but I'd vowed not to spend time with transient pilgrims, end quote. But he does continue with her, walking for 10 days until they separate, but they keep in touch through the hostel book messages and phone calls. He continues with another pilgrim who walks as slowly as he does. And upon arriving at the pilgrim's office, he finds many messages for him pinned on the notice board there. He returns home, readjusts to normal life, and then flies to Germany to meet Helena. He doesn't share the sequel. All three narratives report the success of their fundraising efforts. Dennett raises £30,000 in England and $32,000 in Canada. The penny farthing trio had set a goal of £100,000 and had raised £87,000 by the time their book was published. Nimmo raised £5,000, which was deposited into prearranged bank accounts along the way. Royalties from the book would have added additional monies to these figures. When these books were published, fundraising was of foremost importance. However, today, the value of these books lies in the descriptions of these early modern Caminos when relatively few pilgrims walked the route. The modern Camino has changed since then. It is worth remembering the basic refugios, the pilgrim connections forged before electronic devices, and the warm welcome from local people. These works preserve a disappearing era and are valuable contributions to modern Camino literature. Thank you.